Alright, we are here at what I think I'm going to start referring to as Solitary Park. It's the Kirtland hiking trails, because every time I come, I'm the only person here, which is one of the things I love about it. I can talk and say and do whatever without worrying about disturbing anyone or sounding any weirder than I already am. And so it gives me a nice place to come and talk, and we may not be getting a lot of variety out of these talks, but at the end of the day, I don't think anyone's listening to this because of the nature aspect, but I would hope is maybe listening to this because of the meaning behind what we're trying to go into. Although I don't think anyone's listening to this anyways, for any reason. But that isn't stopping me from recording, because the recording is just as useful to me, maybe more so, as a sort of journal, I suppose, or a way of my working through some of these issues without necessarily having somebody else to work through them with. And I think that's kind of the issue. I mean, ideally you would want to have dialogues with somebody who can ask questions, bounce. It's like a game, bounce the ball back and forth through dialogue. And that's another thing about dialogue as opposed to like argument or whatever. This isn't about proving a point. This isn't about finding what truth is and saying these words are truth. We've already discussed the word is not the thing, which I hate to keep repeating also, because that is something Krishnamurti says all the time, but it's the truth. You can repeat words though and have it not mean the truth. Words are not the truth, and that's the point of that, saying that just saying something is true does not make it true. And even if something is so-called true, the words can never represent the truth. Truth can be expressed in terms of words, but those words never contain the truth. So it's sort of I would say a one-way process, right? Truth begets words, but words do not beget truth, and I think even do not lead one to truth, which is what is so difficult about all of this, because no matter how many words we use, we're not reaching truth. Listening to the words of another is simply building up more ideas within the head, which takes one away from the truth. It's, I don't know what you want to call it, the irony of this whole process, or I don't know what you want to call it, conundrum, is that no number of words ever, an infinite number or nearly infinite or 10 words, can capture truth. Truth comes from some other place, right? Truth comes through observation or through insight, not through words. And one may argue words may inspire the insight or create the insight, but it doesn't really, to the best of my understanding, work that way. That these things come as they may, right? Insight and truth. And even when I say truth comes, it's not even as if truth comes, because truth is, right? Truth is truth, right? It's not my truth, your truth. It's truth, reality, existence. There is only one truth. Or I wouldn't even say one. There is only truth. Everything is contained within that truth, or is a property of that truth, or a manifestation of that truth, or however you want to use the words, but truth is truth. So to understand that, you have to go beyond your individual conceptions and ideas and beliefs and thoughts and words, and something that I've reiterated over and over again, because words can't capture truth, no matter what. No process can. I was listening to a video by Sadhguru who was talking about Jiddu Krishnamurti, and it was interesting but not surprising that he had a lot of good things to say about K. I'll refer to him as K for shortcut. But in the end, he was saying that the problem with K, as he saw it, was that K prescribed no process, no method, nothing that can be done to achieve truth. And he says was of the inclination to think that is not correct. One must have a process of truth. This really divides people. I mean, this belief that there needs to be a process or something to follow versus what Kay taught, which is no process, nothing to follow, no one to follow, figure it out on your own. It's so clear to me that there can be no process, right? But there are people who are fairly well respected people like Sadhguru and I mean other people too, right? That's their whole game. But that is probably why they have to continue propagating that. That is their game. That's their livelihood, right? Like, what would they do? They'd have to close up shop, right? And I'm not saying that they're saying these things for self-centered reasons, but in a lot of ways, you would have to shutter the doors and, you know, put up a for sale sign. If your business is spirituality and you make money from that and that's your living, and then someone comes along and says, follow no one, I mean, if you advocate for that, you're essentially advocating for your own demise as a teacher. But that is the truth. But of course, none of these people are ever going to admit that, right? And, you know, people may say, well, Krishnamurti also was a teacher, and he may very well have been in a sense, but he was very clear about the teachings are to have no teacher, right? A bit of a contradiction, but I think what the point being is that since he does, and even Sadhguru and other people admit, he has no process, he has nothing that he's proclaiming to be, so the very admission is that he may be a teacher, but a teacher of a different sort, one that is not instructing people to follow what he's saying, but one that is saying don't follow anyone, including the speaker, which he says all the time, right? But it can still lead to you, and this goes back to what I said earlier when I said the word is not the thing, and we're trying to find truth, and no number of words can capture truth, right? I mean, that is my own understanding, not repeating his words. You know, to me, I feel like I've had that insight to know that at a deeper level, but the words may seem the same because the words are good words still. The word is not the thing. It's just you can't stop there, right? So you can use words, but you just have to understand the limitations of those words, what is happening when you communicate words. And I can't explain what is beyond words. I don't think anyone can. I would say the source of insight and truth is beyond words, but even that, those are words and not to be communicated. You can't contain it. It's uncontainable, right? It's immeasurable. You can't measure it. It's everything, you know? So how can you articulate everything? You can't. You know, so there's a certain logic and sanity to that, right? To say, I think it's fair to say one cannot capture truth in words as a true statement. You know, that is a form of truth, right? That's what needs to be seen. Because once you see the limitations of words and thoughts and all that, you no longer believe that words or process or whatever thought emanation cannot contain truth. All that drops. Because, and it doesn't matter which teacher, you're not picking teachers anymore, or picking belief systems or ideologies or whatever, which YouTube influencer you choose to follow, or follow no one, follow science, you know, which is also following someone. You can pursue that game endlessly, but it's like the game drops and ends when one says, I don't want to follow the truth of another, because the truth of another is a lie. Because the truth of another is not truth. There is no communication of truth. You have to be a light to yourself. You can't light the light of truth even in another. You can talk endlessly, but it doesn't achieve that end, which is not an end you should be trying to achieve anyways, because that goes back to you're pursuing something, you're seeking something, shouldn't be seeking anything, which is the truth, to not seek. But you could seek not seeking, and then you never get out of it. And this is why it's a vicious cycle. So the best we can do is describe what is, to observe what is, and we can't do any more than that. Any attempt to go beyond that or strive for some goal is purposeless and meaningless, and takes us away from any, what understanding of truth. So that's not what I wanted to discuss today, but it just ended up coming out in this process of inquiry. But what I did have in mind was, and not that we haven't talked about it before, but again, every day is going into something fresh. I don't remember what I've said, honestly, on previous days. I have some vague recollection of topics that have come up, but I don't remember the words. I don't write anything down. I don't try to remember anything, because to me it's like that process of word creation through spontaneous thought, you might say, is revealing. It contains new things, that maybe I haven't even seen before, right? It's like letting truth speak in a way, not driven by your own memory or recollections or desires or what you wanted to talk about, and just sort of letting things flow. There's a danger in that, because you may think you're letting things flow and it's still coming from your subconscious. There's so many parts of the mind that you may not consciously be aware of something, but the mind may unconsciously be doing or saying something. So this is why awareness of even the unconscious mind is important. You can't just be aware of the conscious mind. You may be aware of what you're consciously thinking and doing, but then there are so-called, and I say so-called because is there really an unconscious? It's all there to be seen. I think it's whether we see it or don't see it, right? And what we don't see, we call the unconscious mind. But a lot of times it's because we choose not to see it. It's not that it's not there. One can become aware of all thoughts, conscious or unconscious, and during wake and dreaming. It's all there to be observed. Nothing is hidden, but we tend to compartmentalize and create these categories and separations and divisions between conscious and unconscious and awake and dreaming, and to observe the entire cycle of thought, then all of this is revealed. There's no separation. And that's really the game, I guess, that we're trying to play, is to observe the mind and all of its functioning, the entire process of thought and nature of thought, and use reason where we can use reason. And we can, up to a point, to understand our mind, but then there's a letting go of reason, right? A letting go of rationality to go beyond. And you can't talk about beyond rationality, because that would still be within the realm of rationality, right? So it is more so, going into the normal process of speaking, thinking, talking, observing those words until there's an ending. An ending of the words, an ending of the explanations, and then something new can begin. It's almost like exhaustion, talking to the point of exhaustion. Maybe that's what I'm doing. It's by continuing to talk every day, and maybe about the same things, but in a different way. It's to see the limitations, to observe the limitations of thought, and that you can only go so far. And then maybe the mind understands at that point the limitations, and in some way ends or begins anew. I think is a better way to say it. To begin anew is an ending of the old, which is death. And you could use the word death, complete ending of everything, which is our biggest fear, right? Our biggest uncertainty is what we call death of this body and of this mind, which we don't fully understand, but we're afraid of it anyways. And the way perhaps afraid is to understand what that means. Understand death. What actually is it? Because I think we don't do that. We we have a fear, and we recognize fear, we name fear, and then fear controls us, that thought. And to see that process unfold of where the fear comes from, but then also to go, what is it you're afraid of? You know, to investigate that and try not to make it an analytical process, like I'm afraid of snakes. You know, it's like, okay, well that's a branch of the tree that we talked about before, or a leaf, a tiny little twig on the tree. It's not really what you're afraid of, right? Ultimately, I think the ultimate fear is the fear of ending, the fear of death, and not even of ending the physical body, because we know, I mean, you can't deny the ending of the physical body. What we don't want to accept or understand or see is the ending of the psychological body, the me, you know, that I have built up, full of memories and experiences, what is contained within the brain, that is still a physical phenomenon, right? Memory is a physical phenomenon. Some people still don't believe that, and that's, I mean, I've talked to people who believe in Krishnamurti, not believe in, but who are teachers of Krishnamurti, that don't even, you know, see that memories are a physical thing, that thought is a mechanical process, which is sort of the key observation. You can't even say you understand what Krishnamurti talked about if you don't understand that, but I have seen it. And to me, that was the most fundamental truth that I saw, that when I heard it, it was true. I saw the truth in it, that memories are stored in the brain. I mean, that is one thing science, you know, we don't, I mean, they're not like in there with a little address and you can go right in and say, we know exactly how memories are stored. That's not the point. That there is some storage of the brain. The brain's a recording instrument. And I would say we know that by experimentation with the brain. I mean, you don't need to do that. But even science has said memories are stored in the brain. There's a relationship, right? You can open up a skull and start poking at parts of it and have people remember things from their past or have different sensations. You know, it's very clear that there is a connection between our perception of senses and memory and this physical thing we call a brain, which is inside our head. And of course, the brain doesn't exist in isolation either. It's connected to the rest of our body in a complete whole. It requires the blood and oxygen and, you know, everything else. So you can't just take the brain out. The brain is an interconnected piece. But it is that piece where the rest of the body supports its function of being the storehouse of knowledge, which is memories. And all thinking is a reaction to those memories. So the whole thought process is a mechanical process because it's always occurring, right? You can't stop it from occurring. Thinking is like a physical thing, like a rock falling or a stream flowing. Thinking is flowing. You can't stop that physical process of the brain. And when we speak about ending thought, it's not ending that physical process. It's ending the control that physical process has. That collection or bundle of memories that we regard as the me or the I. That can be altered. That can, because that is a physical structure within the brain, that pattern. There's a pattern in you that defines the you, the me, this belief that I am a separate individual from everything else, and that belief arises from all your memories and says, oh, I remember all these things. I remember my name. I remember where I was born, who my parents were, who my friends were. As a child, I remember going through school. I remember, you know, meeting my wife and getting married and having kids and whatever. I mean, everyone's memories are unique, but they're all related to your experience, right? If you took all that away, took all your experiences away, you wouldn't have those memories. They wouldn't be there. And neither would you. You know, that this is, to see this, right? To observe that without those memories, you would have no recognition of you as a separate entity. It's because of those memories that you do. And as a separate entity, all your fear arises, all your anxiety, depression arises out of this sense that I am a separate entity that needs protecting, that that is unique and most often you believe continues, right? But this continuation is where you run into a problem, because there is a continuation of sorts. Memory persists in the physical structure of the brain, and in that there's a continuity. It doesn't persist perfectly. I mean, people that get dementia, Alzheimer's, and other diseases where the brain deteriorates lose those memories, lose a lot of it, so they lose a part of themselves, a part of this identity that they have called me. In that case, it's caused by disease, but losing that identity, or seeing that identity for what it is the most important truth to be observed. To recognize that that me is a temporary phenomenon, that this individuality that I believe I have is a result of this physical accumulation in the brain of memories, and that certain patterns develop in that brain that gives us this sense of self. But that sense of self is like a pattern that can be disrupted. It can be, without the brain dying, in the physical sense. The brain can die in the psychological sense, in the me, which is what we're concerned about. When we talk about death, and it goes back to what I said, maybe I didn't finish my sentence, the physical body, everyone acknowledges dies, but we want the me, this soul, right? We give it a name. It's called the soul, and in Christianity anyways. That has an identity that we want to continue beyond the death of the physical body. And it's interesting, because that is essentially what we're saying. It's why people have all these religious beliefs, because they don't want that to end, that they want that pattern of thoughts or memories to continue. But you think about that, just think about that with the very brain that you're worried about losing. If you acknowledge that memories are stored in the brain and are therefore subject to decay, just like every other conditioned thing, there will come a time when those memories will all be gone. That the brain, the storehouse of knowledge, this particular brain will end. Brains won't end. The human brains continue, in this pattern of evolution, but this particular instance of a brain and all of its accumulated knowledge will end. And that's a truth many people don't want to accept. And it's not a matter of accepting, right? Accepting is like a resistance against something. Accepting is, I don't see the truth. You don't accept that the sun rises in the morning, right? There's no dispute. It's a truth you see. And with that truth, there is no accept or not accept. It is, I see the truth. It's the same here. See the truth of the origin of the me, the origin of this self-identity that you have. And there is nothing else to discuss. There's nothing to prove. It becomes a fact. And as a fact, it has no truth or false. It is simply a fact, an observable fact, that this me, this collection, bundle of memories, thoughts, going back, is a temporary phenomenon that will not persist. I always think it's interesting that many people can't remember. I used to think about this when I was younger. How is it that we don't remember things when we were a very young age? We don't seem to remember being an infant, the first few weeks of our life. I mean, I don't remember being in the hospital and coming out and, being bottle fed and all that. At some point you start to remember yourself at an older age, once you've accumulated a lot of memories. And that makes sense to me now that I understand the origin of the self, because there weren't enough memories, right? When you're first born, you don't have memories. It may be stored in the brain, but it's not stored and named. It's not stored in such a way that you can recall it, right? Because we recall. It's a very interesting thing. How do we recall memories? How do we recall things? Very often there are words or images, or symbols of some kind or another that are used to index into our mind, right? I mean, it's like a database that indexes into this storehouse of knowledge. And if you just, when you're first adding data, there's no reference point yet. It's just sensory input that's being stored, but with no context. It's no connections between them, and some connections, you know, they're all building. A period of time before there's form to the me. You know, you can say the me is being born after the physical body is born. It takes a while for the me to be born as a separate entity or individual. Up to that point, you know, a baby is just a sensory input. It's observing the world. And when you think about it, look at what it learns in that short period of time by observing. And at that point, it's certainly observing without words and observing without concepts, because there are none yet. That mind is in a pure state of awareness, in a sense. And I'm not going to imagine this again, because, you know, imagining, but there's something to be said about investigating the possibility that the infant mind is in the state that we want to return to, in some sense. Not lose all of our memories, lose our knowledge, but that state of awareness without judging. I mean, there's no judging yet as a newly born infant. It's perceiving the world every day, you know, the sounds, the colors, the sights, and then, you know, patterns start to emerge, and there's a recognition at some point of okay, the word apple means apple, and we start this associative process, which in some way is useful, but in other ways now limits the brain, because now the brain has found a mechanism of stopping inquiry. You know, there's a recognition. This perception process ends with a result or a conclusion, which means perception stops with the conclusion. There's no further inquiry. And I think as we build up this database within our mind of concepts, ideas associated with sensory responses, we start building a library of things. You know, this is when things are born, nouns, you know, and then we map our experiences to these words, and the world becomes simpler then, right? I think this is why it happens. We build simple models of reality. The brain is trying to build, there's like all this immensity and uniqueness that's occurring, but it's too much. And so the brain simplifies the patterns by saying, well, I'm going to come up with this concept or word of a tree, and now anytime I see something that resembles that, it becomes a tree. It simplifies things. I don't have to think about all the different types of trees, or that every tree is unique. Abstraction. It's what we call abstracting. So the process of abstraction is a simplification process of reality. Because in reality, nothing can be abstracted. Everything is concrete, in a sense. You know, every moment is a new moment. Every experience is a new experience that cannot be related to the past. But we make these simplifications and associations. And even the sensations we experience, we label them with words like fear, anxiety, depression, you know, joy. And then we recognize a similar feeling and say, oh, that feeling is fear, so I am afraid. It's like, watch that process, right? That you're experiencing something sensationally through the senses. And then there's a recognition of what that sensation is, a perception, naming. Then the name separates that sensation. It's almost the origin of the self, right? That when we name things, then it becomes separate from us, because a name, you know, fear is that sensation, and then you say, I am afraid, but you don't consider who's the I that's afraid. Or is there just fear? Fear is a sensation that this body and mind is experiencing, but we want to say, I am afraid, because we want to distance ourselves from that sensation and not accept, not observe. Again, it's not acceptance. Observe that that fear arises in the same mind as this sense of self. And there's not two minds, and there's not two separate parts of the mind. One that's the I, and one that's the fear. It's the same entity. So instead of saying, I am afraid, it's like fear is happening, you know, or whatever. It's more of a present state of awareness than a past recognition of something that happened, because also this perception is not occurring. It took time to reach that conclusion about a past sensation, right? If it's occurring now, there's no labeling of what's happening now. There's only labeling of what happened in the past. Even if it's a fraction of a second in the past, it's past. You know, it is like, you know, something's happening where there's fear, and then a minute later you have a memory. There's a recording of that fear, right? And the recording of that fear is compared with previous recordings and says, ah, that's fear. That's the sensation of fear. But was it really? Or is every sensation unique? I mean, is every experience in the body never, ever exactly the same as any previous experience? But we simplify and abstract it down to a set of emotions that we've given names to. But there's no, I mean, there's an infinite number of perception, of emotions, perceptions, you know. How is it we even label? And then you might say, well, then how do, but see, this is where if you're observing what's happening, you're not attempting to label it. That it's when you stop observing that now you're reviewing past events, and your brain has now gone into a past mode, not a present mode. And the past mode is saying, I just experienced fear, and it labels that and stores that along with the sensation to say this sensation is an example of fear, move on. You know, and now maybe it takes the next memory that occurred a second later and does whatever processing of that, but then we're always stuck in the past. This labeling process is always labeling what just happened, not what is happening. There's no labeling with the direct perception of now. It is direct perception of now and what is happening, and observing it, and then not stopping and moving to the past, but continuing to observe what is happening, because that doesn't end. There's no end to what's happening. It's only when we give it an end and then review the record, the past record, that this labeling process occurs, which is, you know, what's happening, and it's what gives us our identity and gives us our vocabulary. And then we live within this conceptual jail of words, ideas, and you're within your vocabulary, right? If you have a limited vocabulary, you only live within that subspace of that vocabulary, because everything gets mapped. Get a little mathematical here, but like every experience gets mapped into a lower dimensional space, you could say, which is just the vocabulary of words that you have to describe experiences. If you want to create another experience, you have to create another word, you know, to describe that unique combination. But it doesn't matter how many words, 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, or 100,000 words, you may get richer, the ability to more richly record your experience in a more nuanced way, but it's still incomplete, because no experience, the past is never repeated, right? Never exactly the way it was. And that means there is no word to describe what's happening. You dumb it down, right? You distill the complex richness of experience into whatever limited conceptual vocabulary you have, and that's how you live your life. And this is why our life is so small as we currently live it, because it all has to fit within that tiny little box, that tiny little subspace, rather than the infinite complexity of now that is happening, that is immensely rich and new in every moment. But we don't see that, because we stop in this process of conceptualization, and then we build this subspace of ideas and concepts and words and live within that subspace. And that's when we get afraid, because within that subspace of words we have the word I and me. Those words, we've invented those words and given meaning to them. And then we have some recognition that there's a special nature to this, that this collection of memories and thought processes, this pattern that emerged of modeling the world in this limited subspace based on memory and perception, has become reality, rather than reality itself, unfettered by these limitations. Not partial and incomplete. But we've stopped seeing that reality. And now we're working within this more limited area. And one could regard this as being perhaps a product of evolution, you know, the fact that organisms need to survive physically, and in order to survive physically, this was required. This is a survival mechanism. You know, a tiger is recognized as a dangerous animal. Not all tigers are dangerous, but there's a recognition that thing, a memory of that thing having killed someone you knew or other. So now that thing has been labeled as dangerous. So you have a tiger that's labeled as dangerous. Stay away from tigers. Or snakes, same thing. Snakes, dangerous. So anytime I recognize something that resembles a snake, I label it as a snake. If you're acute enough, you know the difference between the species of snakes to know some are venomous, some are not. Which alleviates the fear a bit. You don't lump them all into the same category anymore. So there's a nuance there. That little refinement of knowledge may refine your fear, but it doesn't eliminate your fear, because that fear of snakes is the fear of the venomous snake still. And when you see that snake, you react, and your fear causes you to move away from the danger, or whatever action or reaction is the appropriate response for that. And that does keep the body physically alive, right? Avoid eating poisonous red berries or poisonous mushrooms, avoid animals that are dangerous, avoid people that are dangerous, avoid jobs or positions or activities that are dangerous. Keep this organism alive, and there must be memory for that, right? Because if you lived every moment completely free from the past in that regard, you could do dangerous things and die. And that's not what we're talking about either. This is where intelligence comes into play. Because we're not saying have amnesia and totally throw away memories and not know that a poisonous snake is poisonous, or that certain types of tigers. Have that knowledge. That knowledge is useful. Don't live within that limited subspace, though. Recognize that you are immense, and more than that limited vocabulary, and that there is an existence beyond that. It's like a one-dimensional. Reminds me of the movie, you know, the book Flatland, and you know, where these two-dimensional objects encounter three-dimensional objects passing through their space, and it's amazing to them because they are only limited by their perception of two-dimensional reality. So these three-dimensional objects look like 2D slices, you know, through like a sphere intersecting with a plane. The plane they live in looks like a circle that starts from a dot, grows big to a circle, and then shrinks back to a dot and disappears. And that perception from their perspective looks like magic. Looks like something just appeared in front of them, grew to a certain size, and disappeared, right? Which is an unnatural phenomenon that, you know, in that limited space cannot be understood. It requires sort of a, you know, an understanding of the higher dimensional concept of mathematical, you know, knowledge, and that's still within the now, you know, the realm of math, right? The realm of knowledge, but it does point to an important point, and that is not itself reality, but that we're limited by the dimensions that we have available to us. And you know, those dimensions in vector spaces, right, are independent vectors, you could say. Like, there's only so many of them, and you can say a vector space has a set of basis functions, and anything in that vector space is simply a linear combination of those basis functions. And that's kind of how we think. It may be a high-dimensional vector space, meaning there's millions of vectors, billions of vectors, but still finite and limited. There's only so much that can be represented within that space. So understanding the brain is like that. The brain is going to limit the experience. This is also related to Plato's cave, right, where Plato recognized shadows on a cave to people that were strapped in a chair that lived in that cave. Those shadows on the wall become reality. They don't perceive the reality outside the cave or understand that there is a reality outside of all of that. So I think everyone, the ancient Greeks, I mean, everybody recognizes, mathematicians, that there are limitations to our perception. That what we can perceive and see is limited, and we limit it further through the mind's conceptualization process by taking what the senses receive, which is even infinitely complex, and then mapping it onto a lower dimensional space that removes all of that richness and complexity, but makes it manageable for us for the purpose of survival. But why do we want to survive? You know, there you get to that point where if survival becomes the dominant drive in life, there is a me, and it's most important for me to survive. Again, you lose, well, what about this other person? What about all of humanity? Those are all me's. Is every me for himself, or do we understand that even, you know, humanity collectively as a whole is something bigger than just the individuals that we might like to think of ourselves as, even though we're not, but we perceive ourselves as these separate individuals, separate from the rest of humanity, when we are humanity, all of humanity, and we are simply instances of this same class of humanity. And to see that, then it opens up a whole new game, right? A whole new understanding of reality and the world, not as a collection of individuals fighting each other, but as this whole process, this whole reality that goes beyond our individual identities. And, you know, you can't completely think your way to that point, but you can sort of start getting around the edges, which is, I think, what we're doing, right? Seeing that, you know, examining this perception of me, maybe how it arises, maybe as an evolutionary process. Well, more so, how does this process of the mind, this conceptualization, right? Because even more fundamental than me is that the mind conceptualizes, abstracts reality, simplifies reality. And one of those simplifications, one of those patterns that arises, is this pattern of the me. There's other patterns. It's not the only pattern. This is why you don't disappear with the understanding of the pattern of the me. The mind is still there. The brain is still there, right? It's just, there's a different, it's almost like it shifts into a different quantum state, if we want to put it that way. There's a transition, or something happens, which again we have to be careful, because all those are products of time, but that pattern of thinking, the pattern of the me may dissolve, may die, right? The identity may die, but the brain continues in its physical way with its activities, but as a whole, because you can imagine that this little pattern of the me is a tiny little pattern, a tiny little groove in the brain, you know, this sense, you know, that I need to protect and be small and contained, and there's a center of me, and that I need to, there's a periphery. Once there's a center, there's a periphery. There's a me and not me, right? There's a me up to a certain point, the body. You could draw a line around it and say, what's inside this is me, and what's outside of that is not me, and create that division, both physically and mentally. But it's an arbitrary division also, where you draw that line between you and everything else, even physically, right? We're constantly breathing. I mean, I'm breathing air in and out, in and out. I mean, I'm drinking water, I'm eating food, and eliminating waste, and, you know, even just the moisture of my body is perspiring. There's no clear physical boundary even to this me that we create. But we roughly would draw a line around the skin or something, right? Say, what's in here is me, and what's out there is not me. But we're constantly exchanging mass and energy with the rest of the world. So it's not so clear at any, you can't just take a snapshot at one point in time and say this is me and this is not me. It's much more complicated than that, right? But that's where understanding and intelligence comes into play. That we have what could be useful idea of me, but recognizing that that's not the story. That's not the total story. That there are patterns, physical patterns and mental patterns that develop, but don't let those patterns become your whole reality, because they're not. There's a whole reality that is beyond that is much richer than that, goes beyond the physical body, beyond the mental body, beyond the conceptions that we have. Those are all limitations. And to see that truth. And you know, I was thinking as I'm coming back to the parking lot, I was remembering what I had intended to talk about, and I don't think it was any of this. But one thing I was going to talk about was insecurity, and the fact that we live in an insecure world where we have a lot of fears, or we have, I don't know what you call them, fears. We have expectations in this world. We expect, you know, to live another day, expect our house to still be there. But people have fires in their houses, right? Their houses are destroyed. Your house may be there one day, not there the next. People you know are alive one minute. You may expect them to be there tomorrow, but then they die today and they're not there tomorrow. Or this is true of pets, this is true of anything. Or you have a job today, something happens, you don't have that job tomorrow. Like, that's our life. It's full of these insecurities, these things that change, that we expect to not change, but they change anyways, because that's life. And then we have fear, well, we experience sorrow as a result of change, and then fear of change, more change in the future. And this is how we build ourselves up into, you know, our expectations weren't met, and we become sad and sorrowful because we had an idea or an image in our mind of what our life is, even just our life from today to tomorrow, right? You had some idea what today was like, yes, or today, what you thought today would be like yesterday. But did today turn out to even be what you thought it was yesterday? Or you didn't even have that much of a conception, but you had a vague notion of what you're going to wake up and do today. And I mean, I had a vague notion, and it ended up not being what I thought. In fact, it's constant disappointment, constant change, right? Constant, you know, we can't perceive the future in all of its detail. The future is like a misty notion that we project the past into what we call this future and say, well, tomorrow, this is what tomorrow is going to be like. And you can have a plan. I mean, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to eat breakfast, I'm going to go to work, you know, do these things. But then imagine all the details that are not in that plan that occur. And then the major things might shift, right? Something, you know, you might get into an accident on the road. And so then the whole game changes. This happens all the time. I mean, people, you know, I mean, Lindsey Graham, just to use an example, a famous politician who just died of a sudden and mysterious illness, which I don't think they have fully figured out yet, or even had a proper diagnosis. Well, that's not what he expected. I mean, the previous day, right, you know, he was living his life, he made plans for next week, and those plans never came about. Life ended at that point for that person, and there's no more, you know, of that collection of memories and experiences that we called Lindsey Graham, right? And you know, this he's just one well-known person, but this happens to millions, if not, you know, millions of people every day. I guess I don't know what the birth rate is, but death rate, I imagine it's millions every day, considering that the population is billions. I would imagine that millions of people die every day that expected to see tomorrow and didn't see it. But they're also, their brain is gone, so they're not sad about it, because that sad process requires the brain, which is no more. So there's no sadness of that person in death. It's over. You know, that there's an ending to that pattern of that particular person or individual. And that's going to happen to us too. Every one of us will end up at some point, the physical body, being a conditioned thing, will come and go and end at some point. And so will all these memories and fears and sorrows and all the other things, and all the pleasurable moments and all the happiness and all that will come to an end. And you can believe it will continue, but you have to examine that belief, why it is you think that's true, and get past the conflict, because you know somewhere deep inside you that everything around you changes and ends. Why would this body and mind be any different? But you want to believe it is, because that fear within you of ending leads to the belief of not ending. Belief, not fact. And take your pick at the belief. There's, which also shows, right, that there are that many beliefs about how things continue, different, that none of them can be true because they're all different. Right? So some people try to find commonalities among different belief systems and try to take the average of everything and say, well, this is common, but it's just common because fear is common. And the fear to continue, or the desire to continue and not die is at the root of our existence. It's an evolved quality or trait that we have. But it's like to see all of this as the truth in its entirety, not in the pieces, parts, but to see all of it can open up to a new reality that is more than what the reality that we have now is, that goes beyond these simple ideas of life and death and ending and beginning, and just there's a more rich reality. And don't imagine what that reality is. Don't conceive of what that richer reality is. See that reality, observe it, not explain it or have somebody explain to you, oh, this is what that reality is like, which is mostly what all religions and theories and gurus and whatnots and who-nots do. I know the truth. I know more than you. I will convey that truth to you for a small fee or whatever, even if it's just their own ego stroking, to believe they understand that truth more than you. And I'm not claiming that I understand this truth more than you or more than anybody. I'm suggesting that you look at it. I'm simply suggesting that you observe your own body and mind. If it turns out I'm full of crap, then so be it. But most people are afraid to do that investigation. They're afraid of what they might find. Maybe they're afraid of seeing the truth, so they don't look. Because if you looked and saw that all of this will end, but even within religion traditions, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, right? That's in Christianity. But I don't know that anyone ever realizes it, for real. Rather than just going to Palm Sunday, getting ashes, smeared across your face, see that for the ultimate truth that it is. That we are born and we will die. And ashes, we come from the earth. And the patterns of life have evolved. We are one pattern in an infinitely complex pattern of life that comes and goes. And this experiences and everything that's accumulating in the brain will end. And it doesn't mean you despair. It's quite opposite of despair, because despair is what happens when you still have that sense of me. When there's no sense of me anymore, there's no despair, because there's no me that's despairing. It's just life now, in all of its richness and glory, in all of its magnificence, and not concerning yourself with ending or worried about the ending that is inevitable. But you are alive now. There is life now, and there is life after you so-called die as well. If you see what is happening as this process of the universe unfolding, you may be a ripple in the water, but the water doesn't go away. When that ripple is gone, there's more ripples, and those ripples continue, and the energy from one ripple goes into another ripple, and but from this one can start conceptualizing systems now of belief and reincarnation and all of that, and life after death and all of these concepts. Just throw all the concepts away. The concepts don't matter. Observe what's actually real. Observe if anything does persist or last. But observe without words. Because if you still live within that limited vector space of words, observing doesn't help you. Because everything latches onto one of those basis vectors, one of those words or concepts you have, and you can't go beyond that concept. So one has to observe without words, without this naming, without bringing in the past ideas. It's not about rejecting the past ideas. It's just not having them play a part anymore. They just aren't there. And to see things fresh. As fresh, if not fresher than a newborn baby sees things. And I can't remember what it's like to be a newborn baby, so I don't know what that is, but I can only imagine it's something akin to that, in that there's a observation of sights, sounds, and seeing everything fresh and new for the first time every single day as a newborn baby, every day. You know, you die to yesterday and you are born again to a new world every single day, every single minute, every single second of every day. There's an ending of the old and a rebirth of the new. And in those ways, right, we can use the words rebirth and all these things, and it brings in all kinds of baggage. But just understand those words, the way I'm using them is not to bring in these concepts from the past, but maybe breathe new life into these words. What can they really mean? And is there really is creation? You know, is creation occurring all the time? Creation is like the ending of the old, the beginning of the new. There's no creation with the continuation of the old. That's not creating anything. It's just continuing the pattern of the old. Is there creation of new? What is new? Is anything new? Some people would say nothing is new under the sun. Is that true? It's worth investigating. But within your own mind, within this own mind, to see that as long as the patterns of the past propagate, and that when you view the present moment through the past, it's not new anymore. It's simply the old rearranged. Rearranging like the pieces on a chessboard or a checkerboard. Still the same game, just the pieces are in a different place. As long as you're playing the game, and the checker pieces are your past memories, and you're just moving them around on the board, you will never realize that there is more to life than checkers or chess, right? You have to go beyond that limited space. So just be open and aware without any of that occurring, and acknowledge, observe that everything conditioned ends, but observe, you know, what might be beyond words, beyond this finite world, right? Maybe there is something infinite, immeasurable, sacred, but you're never going to see it as long as you are tied to your idea of the immeasurable, infinite, and sacred. That idea will hold you back from seeing what's real, which is why it's necessary to drop all those ideas, drop them all, and see what is real. And if there is something immeasurable, immense, and beyond words that we can't describe, then there may be some hope of that coming to you, rather than you going to that seeing you, and seeing within you that you, not to say can receive that, or you're capable, you know, you're an empty vessel. I don't want to get too conceptual here, but if you become empty, you can be filled, right? But as long as you contain things, like a jar full of sand or rocks, then nothing can be put in that jar. So becoming empty of this idea of yourself, empty of your concepts, empty of everything, right? Emptiness in that way of giving up those, you know, emptying the jar in some sense. And there's no idea what the jar will contain. You can't imagine what the jar will contain, because if you do, it's the past again. Just empty. You know, empty the contents of consciousness. I mean, meditation can be thought of as emptying the contents of consciousness that are filling up your consciousness right now, that make no room for anything new. Your mind is like a jar that's filled with rocks and sand, and there's just no room for anything more until the contents are emptied. But you can't empty them yourself, because in that emptying process, that is who does the emptying, and that who does the emptying are rocks in the jar themselves. So even if you empty most of the jar, you'll still have the rocks in that jar of you, the controller, the emptier, the one who empties, the one who controls, the one who meditates, the one who observes. As long as you hold on to that idea in any way, shape, or form, even the most minutest way, that jar is not empty. So meditation, the process of examining all of this, which is what we're doing, inquiry, examining the mind, the nature of mind, the nature of ourselves, seeing it not through concepts but through observation, is helping in some sense to empty the mind, or at least allow that as a possibility, to become empty, not too empty, not to be the active emptier, but just giving up on preventing the emptying from happening. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it. We're always holding on to these things, preventing the jar from being empty. It's more like just let go of these things as being important. Let them become empty. Let them be shed, just like the locust or the, sheds its skin. Whatever. The snake sheds its skin, right? May not have the perfect biological examples, but the shedding of the old to make room for the new. So that is something along the lines of what is occurring in this brain today. So this was a good walk, I guess a good inquiry. If you listen to all this, then I hope maybe it, in some small way, it helps, or maybe just points to your own process. But you just have to make this your own. You can't listen to another talk or whatever. It has to, which is why I do this, because this is my way, or a way, or this mind's way of working through it, of seeing what it is. And all right, we'll leave it there, and maybe go into all of this next time in a different way, on a new day. And everything is new and fresh every day. Bye.